Assalamualaikum. Peace be with you all. We will get started with the recitation of Holy Quran. I request Bashara Sahib to please present and make the recitation. And I also request Haris Sahib to please come to the podium.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وما أرسلناك إلا رحمة للعالمين ما كان محمد أبا أحد من رجالكم ولكن رسول الله وخاتم النبيين وكان الله بكل شيء عليما والذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وآمنوا بما نزل على محمد وهو الحق من ربهم كفر عنهم سيئاتهم وأصلح بالهم. I start with the name of God in merciful, gracious and merciful. I just recited 3 verses from Holy Quran, chapter 21, verse 108. Chapter 33, verse 41, and chapter 43, verse 3. And the translation is, and we have sent thee not but as a mercy for all people. Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but he is the messenger of God and the seal of the prophets. Allah has full knowledge of all things. But as for those who believe and do good works, and believe in that which has been revealed to Muhammad, and it is the truth from their Lord, He removes from their sins. He removes from them their sin and improves their condition.
Thank you very much, Shah Sahib. I'm Mirza Luqman, and I'm president of the Portland chapter of Ahmadiyya Muslim Community. We are 75 chapters in the United States. We are going to have a short program, hopefully 2 speeches, less than an hour. Then we're going to have time for question and answers. And after that, we will serve the lunch downstairs. And those who want to enjoy the sun, they can have it outside. So I request our first speaker, Salman Ahmed Sahib. He will describe the life of Holy Prophet as well as examples from the Holy Quran, which illustrate that Islam is a religion of peace. Salman Ahmed is a engineering manager at Intel in Hillsborough. Salman Sahib.
أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Assalamu alaikum. I extend my greetings to all of you. When I first moved to Portland 13 years ago or so, someone told me a joke. He said, what comes after 2 rainy days in Oregon?
Another one.
Monday. It seemed to be true for a few years, but it's changing now. And so I'm honored to have you all here on this very, very fine day. My jacket didn't fit me this morning, so I wore this, and I'm regretting it now because it's kind of warm. I see some faces that have been here before. I see some new faces. I know we have friends, we have neighbors, we have guests who are here. For those of you who have come here before, you know that I have managed to escape having to talk before. So this is my first time on this particular topic at this mosque. And so I figured I would illustrate the feelings that go through the heart of any true Muslim when he or she hears news of yet another atrocity committed in the name of Islam. So I was born in the mid-70s, and from what I can remember, some of my earliest memories of hearing about things like these were whispered discussions between my parents at the dinner table or after some new hijacking or the other of some TWA or Pan Am airline or something to this effect. I was, of course, too young to know or really even care. Through the 80s, the early 80s, the various conflicts that happened in the Middle East seemed to be prominent in the news. I lived in a small country in West Africa at that time, and so all our news came through the BBC on shortwave radio, and I'm sure some of you remember that. So I was sitting in front of one of those radios in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. And that same year, the Soviets left Afghanistan. And I remember I was 14 years old at that time, and I remember feeling great hope that maybe things were turning in the world. And then as I was coming of age, that I would experience a world that had peace. And in 1989, it all seemed possible and all seemed hopeful. I was in the last year of high school when the first Iraq War occurred. It was very short, I think just a month or so. I was in the last year of high school, so I was worrying about things that people in the last year of their high school worry about, grades. And it seemed so short that it didn't take away from the feeling of hope that I had in my heart. I was in college here in Minnesota in 1995 when the Oklahoma bombing occurred, and I was driving when I heard it on the radio. And I must admit with some shame that the first thought that went through my mind was, God, I hope it's not someone claiming to be Muslim. And it was a visceral feeling in my gut. And for the entire drive home, I hoped that that wasn't the case. And when the news confirmed that it wasn't the case, I again admit with some regret that my concern, I felt relief. Now, I should have felt concern for the victims and so forth, but I put that to my age. But it was relief, and it was relief that it wasn't someone claiming to be Muslim who had committed these atrocities. For 9/11, I was in California, I was working, and on the West Coast, it was early enough to where I hadn't left for work yet. And I turned the TV on while having breakfast, and the first plane had hit. And by this time, between that first and the second plane, there were a few minutes of maybe it's just an accident. And I clung onto that with every fiber that I could and hoped that this wasn't the case. And of course, that didn't end up being. And so, everyone knows the world changed at that moment, and it hasn't set itself aright since then. The things that have happened over the last few years seem to have made things even worse than they could have been. We are inundated every day, it feels like, with news of what ISIS is doing. Horrible, horrible things in the Middle East. And it feels like hundreds of thousands of lives are affected daily. Millions of people are displaced, and it's the disorder that they're creating is is on such a massive scale that all of us feel it. And now, of course, the attacks in LA and Paris and Belgium and in other places. And then in Nigeria, which is near to my heart because I grew up in Western Africa, Boko Haram and the kidnappings that they have committed there, and the killings and so forth. And all of these are the people who perpetuate, who do these crimes, claim it, and we believe wrongly, in the name of Islam. And whatever ideology they have, it seems to be focused on nothing more than creating disorder and creating panic and creating a sense of dread and discomfort. And that is, I'm sure you feel it, I feel it as well. And so it's this, whenever I hear something like this, and I'm sure this goes through the heart of every Muslim and every person, there's these bewildering set of emotions that attack. The first one, of course, is sorrow and pain for the victims. And this is not something I used to feel when I was much, much younger, but of course now as I'm older, my thought immediately goes to all the people whose children have been hurt, or whose children have been kidnapped, whose lives have been put in danger. The refugees who are pouring out of the Middle East and going elsewhere, taking all their children, their lives on their backs and exiting the country. And so that's the first emotion that goes through my heart. The second one is this pain that I feel, most I'm sure all Muslims feel, the pain that's being done to the damage that's being done to true Islam, that which we carry within our hearts. And I was trying to think over the last few days of examples that I could give to those who are not Muslims about something like that, that maybe they can feel. I couldn't come with anything that's not contrived, so I decided not to. But I just wanted to state that feeling, that pain for the damage that's been done to true Islam is something that follows immediately after the pain that we feel for the victims of these crimes. And then rising from those things is this desire to educate, to rectify the thinking of the Muslims of the world. It's really to face the reality of these atrocities being done in the name of Islam, and to try to do something to affect that and to change that. There's some futility here, because it should not take a faith or a religion or an explanation of what's written in the book to tell someone not to do something that is so horrifying. This should be something that's innate within our nature. And so it is, I hear on the news occasionally people will say, well, we need to see more Muslims standing up against this. And we here in this mosque do that often, do that always. But I always do feel in my heart that it ought not to take an explanation to a so-called Muslim of the truth of their faith to get them to not do this. That should just be a basic human instinct, to not harm and not destroy. So what I will do today in my speech is to address the pain done to the damage, is to address the damage done to true Islam by picking some things from the Quran and from the life of the Holy Prophet of Islam, may peace and blessings of God be upon him, to illustrate to you what Islam really stands for. And then Brother Haris will speak about the efforts that are being done by this community to attempt to galvanize Muslims into real action, to address these myths that have crept into the faith. So there's one more thing, which was the pain for the victims, and I'll just address that quickly. So we here do as much as we can to help the victims of the crimes that are being committed in the Middle East. We have a global charity called Humanity First that has set up schools for Syrian refugees, among many of the other good things that they do around the world. Every few weeks we donate blood. We have the Red Cross come here. Some of you may be on that list. And we collect, I don't know, upwards of 300 bags of blood a year, something like this, just in this chapter alone, in this mosque alone, as a way to personify, to make real our commitment to the sanctity of life. Okay, so turning to explaining what Islam really stands for, I picked a few verses from the Quran, and to address what I think is what appears to be the real motivation of groups like ISIS and Boko Haram. It seems to me that really the only thing they want to do is to create disorder in the land and to create fear. There appears to be no other political, even their political aspirations do not seem to make any sense whatsoever. It feels like they're just bent on destruction and on fear. And so I searched through the Quran for verses, and I found so many that I had to cut it real short. So I'll read some out to you. In chapter 2, verses 27 through 29, God says, He says, "And none does He adjudge thereby to be erring, except the disobedient, who break the covenant of God after having established it, and cut asunder what God has bidden to be joined, and create disorder in the earth. It is these that are the losers. How can you disbelieve in God? When you were without life, He gave you life, and then He will cause you to die, and then restore you to life, and then to Him shall you be made to return. It is He who created for you all that is in the earth. Then He turned towards the heavens, and He perfected them as 7 heavens, and He knows all things." So this is in the second chapter of the Quran. The first chapter is a very short one, and I recited it at the beginning of my talk. And by the 30th verse in it, God describes those who create disorder in the earth as being of the losers, and it is those that He judges to be in error. So right there, if any of these people would take the trouble to read the very book that they claim to be the basis of their faith, they would see that not very far in at all, it is God declares them to be in error. In chapter 5, God says, "On account of this, we prescribed for the children of Israel that whosoever killed a person, unless it be for killing a person or for creating disorder in the land, it shall be as if he had killed all mankind. And whoso gave life to one, it shall be as if he had given life to all mankind. And our messengers came to them with clear signs, yet even after that, many of them commit excesses in the land." And here, this is a verse that many Muslims recount on occasions such as these, because God describes, not to Arabs or to Muslims, but He says He made this declaration since the time of the children of Israel. That all the prophets going back there, God made it clear that when you create disorder, that if you kill one person unjustly, it is as if you had murdered the whole of mankind. And if you save a life, it's as if you had saved it all. In chapter 7, God recounts the message that He sent to many prophets over time, taking them by name. Some of them you will recognize from the Bible, some of them are not mentioned by name in the Bible. And He describes the message that He gave them. So in chapter 7, in verse 56 and 57, God tells us humans what to do. He says, "Call upon your Lord in humility and in secret. Surely he does not love the transgressors, and create not disorder in the earth after it has been set in order. And call upon him in fear and hope. Surely the mercy of God is nigh unto those who do good. In verse 86 of the same chapter, he says, And to Midian we sent their brother Shuaib. He said, O my people, worship God. You have no other deity but him. A clear sign has indeed come to you from your Lord. So give full measure and full weight, and diminish not unto people their things, and create not disorder in the earth after it has been set in order. This is better for you if you are believers. In verse 104, about another prophet, God says, Then after them we sent Moses with our signs to Pharaoh and his chiefs, but they unjustly rejected them. Behold then, what was the end of those who created disorder? So in this chapter, again and again and again, God describes the message to people being to not create disorder. And using the example of Pharaoh and his people describes what happens to the people who create disorder. Specifically that. It's the creation of disorder that God dislikes. Now, there are verses in the Quran, two of which I will mention today, that do give permission to fight. And these are verses that are wrongly used by the kinds of people who commit these atrocities. And so I want to tell you what they are, and you will hear just from the words themselves what they're really supposed to mean. Before I get to those verses, though, I want to put them in context. There is everything in Islam, everything that's in the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, we believe came from God. And God's message was given to us through the Quran, which is a revelation which occurred over 22 years. There are copies downstairs for those of you who have not seen one. And the central figure was the Holy Prophet of Islam, may peace and blessings of God be upon him. And I want to give you a brief life sketch so you can place the revelations of these verses in their proper context. The Prophet was born in 570 AD, and he got married at the age of 25 to a woman who was 15 years his senior. He was 40 years old when he received the first revelation from God that is captured in the Quran. So he was 40 years old. When he left Mecca to go to Medina, which is a very arduous journey, and I'll explain why he left, he was 52 years old. And he died when he was 61 or 62, thereabouts. In this time that he was in Mecca, as first his wife, then his friend, and those people who knew him, and then, as always happens in the lives of prophets, the poor, the downtrodden, the enslaved first accepted his message. And as this new group of people started to form, that put away the binds of clan, of tribe, and focus instead on living a good life together in God's name, the people in Mecca grew, the powers that be in Mecca grew extremely concerned. And so there was a concerted effort to bring this to an end. First through pleading, then through trying to get pressure put upon them. And eventually when the Prophet was 51, an utter economic boycott of all the Muslims. This got to be so extreme that many Muslims who numbered maybe in the hundreds in those days left Mecca to neighboring towns. That year, where there was an economic boycott, the hardships that the Prophet was put through were extreme. There was an economic blockade, no one would trade with them, finding food was extremely hard. The Prophet's uncle, who was his guardian at that time, passed away, and his beloved wife also passed away. That's why in Islam it's called the year of sorrows. The year after that, the opposition, once his uncle passed away and the protection that was provided to him by his uncle's presence passed away, it seemed to be that there was no way out for him except to leave Mecca and go to Medina. He left in the dead of night with his friend. He was pursued. A bounty was placed on his head. He was pursued. Even today, driving from Mecca to Medina takes 4.5 hours. In those days, of course, the journey was far more arduous. It took 2 weeks of hiding in the desert and walking on a camelback to actually make it there. So he was now 52 years old and would not live but for another decade. When he got to Medina and he finally had the peace that he had sought for years. The people of Medina, and when he was able to preach in peace, it became rapidly apparent that this new thing that had formed would not be squashed. And so the Meccans contrived to attack him in Medina, and 1,000 warriors were sent to Medina from Mecca, and they were faced by 300 infirm, some young, some strong. They had 2 horses among them, compared to at least 100 from the Meccans. The Meccans expected to crush and win, and they didn't. They were defeated. That was the first war, the first battle that the Prophet took place in, and it was a battle purely of defense. An army 1,000 strong traveled 2 weeks across the deserts to attack where he lived. After the defeat of this, they returned a year later or so, and they were again met by a small number and were again fought to a draw. And that's it. These are the 2 fights. These are 2 battles. So those who claim or who think that the Prophet lived a life of war, history belies this. The Prophet's life, unlike the Prophets of old, is part of what we would consider the historical record. So you can go look up. There's many scholars. There's lots of books. There's books downstairs, things that you can research online. The life of the Prophet is very well documented and very well known. And it's those 2 wars, the wars of defense that he took part in, those 2 battles of defense that he took part in, that are the sum of the battles that he fought. 6 years after he landed in Medina, after these 2 battles, he signed a truce with Mecca. He sought to take his followers and perform pilgrimage in Mecca, as is done to this day. And the Meccans, in fear of what that would mean, agreed to a truce if he would go back and not come that year, and come back after some time. And so he returned that year after having signed that truce. 2 years after that, a year or 2 after that, I'm not sure exactly when, he returned to Mecca with 10,000 followers. So when he left less than 10 years before, there were only a few hundred. But that truce, that time of peace, and people joined in droves this prophet of God's who taught peace, which is what really the word Islam means. And when he returned with 10,000, there was no battle. There was really nothing the Meccans could do. And when Mecca then, it's said, it fell to the Muslims, it didn't fall as much as the Meccans realized that this was a force that could not be stopped. And there were 10,000 people with the Holy Prophet. This was the year 8 after Hijrah, after the migration from Mecca to Medina, and he died 1 or 2 years later. And this is the beginning of Islam. For 52 years, for 53 years, he lived entirely in peace, facing bitter persecution amidst those he would consider his townspeople and his family. And when he left, he didn't create any disorder in that land. When he left, far, far away, he was attacked twice where he lived. And he had to defend himself. Now, there's one more thing I'll say, I will quote to you before I close. There are many examples in the life of the Prophet that I can point to. I picked this particular one because it forms a covenant that the Prophet wrote out to the Christians. This covenant exists. It exists to this day, actually, in a monastery. And I'll read out these 2 paragraphs so you can get a sense of what the Prophet really stood for. He says, "I promise that any monk or wayfarer who will seek my help on the mountains, in forests, deserts, or habitations, or in places of worship, I will repel his enemies with my friends and helpers, with all my relatives and with all those who profess to follow me, and will defend them because they are my covenant. And I will defend the covenanted against the persecution, injury, and embarrassment of their enemies in lieu of the poll tax they have promised to pay. If they prefer to defend their properties and persons themselves, they will be allowed to do so and will not be put to any inconvenience on that account. No bishop will be expelled from his bishopric, no monk from his monastery, no priest from his place of worship, and no pilgrim will be detained in his pilgrimage. None of their churches or their places of worship will be desolated or destroyed or demolished. No material of their churches will be used to build mosques or houses for the Muslims. Any Muslim doing so will be regarded as recalcitrant to Allah and His Prophet. Monks and bishops will be subject to no tax or indemnity, whether they live in forests or on rivers, in the east or in the west, in the north or in the south. I give them my word of honor. They are on my promise and covenant and will enjoy perfect immunity from all sorts of inconveniences. Every help shall be given them in the repair of their churches. They shall be absolved of wearing arms. They shall be protected by the Muslims. Let this document not be disobeyed till the day of judgment." This is what the Prophet had written down as the covenant to the Christians that lived in the Middle East at that time. And this is the message that I wish everyone knew about, not just those who commit atrocities in the name of Islam, but also those against whom these atrocities are committed, so that they know that the blame is on those who claim to follow a message, not on the message itself. It is this true picture of Islam, of the Prophet, that true Muslims call attention to. And I believe, as is demonstrated here, that when people of faith unite on the truth, when they learn it and they teach it, then we have a chance for peace. And that's all of us. And to me, this is as important for us to come together and learn of each other. So the only things that die anymore are the untruths, the misgivings, the ugly myths, the bigotry, the walls, the hatred. And the only things that live are the light of God and the light of faith. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Our next speaker is Haris Zafar. I'm sure many of you already know him or seen him, so I don't need to introduce in any more detail, but he actually is a software engineer and works for an IT company here in Portland. So Haris Zafar.
Good afternoon, everybody. I haven't heard that for a long time. I used to be a software engineer back in my smart days. Then I got promoted. into more of a management role, but that's what happens to us when we lose our skills. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, especially as someone mentioned, on an incredibly beautiful day like this. I'm sure it's a bit torture to look outside the window and see what you're missing. If you'd like, we could close the blinds so there's no constant reminder. But this is an important conversation, and I'll give you a few words, and then we'll open it up to more of a dialogue so that it's a two-way conversation. As we just heard from Salman, there are many examples that he had cited over history of violence or even outright terror that have been incited or implemented at the hands of those who are claiming to follow Islam. And as he has beautifully explained, are stark violations to the teachings of Islam, to the true original documented teachings of Islam. This is why Muslims have been so outspoken over the past several years whenever they see any act of violence committed in general, but especially those who are saying to do it because they're Muslims. And in our condemnation of groups like ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Al-Shabaab, and unfortunately the list keeps growing. Yet there are a growing number of people who suspect or even conclude that there's a problem with Muslims who easily become radicalized, or even a problem with Islam itself. And so that's what I'd like to address in my short remarks and talk about what we could do about this together. Before diving into Islam itself, let's understand that there are two matters at play in this conversation. There's a system, and then there's a people who claim adherence to that system. And these two are not the same. And for us here in the US, it's actually very easy to understand this. Just in 2015 alone, the great number of incidents involving unarmed Americans, mostly black Americans, who have been killed at the hands of police officers has sparked nationwide uproar. But certainly I don't believe any of us would ever conclude that the problem lies in the system of law enforcement and that we shouldn't have police officers anymore. We would not demand that all police officers be held responsible for the actions of the militias. Of course, we wouldn't do that because that would be an irrational response. We know that policing and law enforcement is a good system, something that is beneficial and provides value to us as a society as well as us as individuals. And that system can't be smeared due to the actions of those who didn't live up to the standards of that system. This applies to Islam as well. It is a faith and belief system that governs our lives as individuals and guides us on how to find God, how to increase our relationship with Him, and to live a peaceful and just existence. And certainly, there are those who have not lived up to that standard that Islam has expected or set of all of us. People claiming adherence to our faith who have said things or have done things that are incredibly heinous. And we can't dismiss that by simply saying, well, this has nothing to do with Islam, so I'm just going to ignore it. Because, of course, we know that their words and actions don't live up to the standard of Islam. But we have to understand, even as Muslims, what role their beliefs has played in their path towards extremism. And of course, the experts, I'll start with the experts, not people like me, the experts have found compelling truths for us to consider. For example, John Horgan is a psychologist specializing in terrorism. He's a former director of the International Center for the Study of Terrorism at Penn State, who has even interviewed members of a wide variety of terrorist groups once they're captured. And he's concluded that there are many factors that come well before religion in the lives of those who turn to this life of extremism. Things like disillusionment, isolation, anger, a search to be a part of something that's meaningful in their life, restoring honor either for themselves or some perceived victims, and a belief that joining a movement offers social and psychological benefits such as adventure, as camaraderie, and a heightened sense of identity. This has been the result of his studies, which he continues, and I don't want to put his whole resume up on the slide, but just to indicate his level of expertise in this field. However, with that as a backdrop, religion does play a role. It plays a very critical factor in the people that we're talking about. Religion is applied in the recruitment efforts of groups like ISIS, of Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, etc., in order to convince these disillusioned youth, wherever they are, not only of a path to resolving their grievances, but also promising them some sort of eternal salvation for doing so. And this is where religion is leveraged. It is used to beautify an otherwise ugly ideology that's hell-bent on murder, destruction, and terror. Three things that are explicitly forbidden in Islam. But people still fall for the rhetoric. And they begin to believe that following this path of extremism and following the objectives of these individual organizations will not only make them feel better, but will also somehow please God. And these militant clerics that do exist, these clerics who call themselves imams or sheikhs or ayatollahs and whatever name they can think of, are able to convince these naive youth that there's a religious justification largely due to this seemingly subtle perversions of Islam that are taught around the world, even here in the West, even by peaceful, seemingly moderate Muslim leaders, here even in the United States. In their upbringing, Muslim youth are taught things, principles, that may not lead them to extremism by themselves, but they introduce and create these cracks in their religious foundation that can be easily exploited by extremists later on in their life, causing the total destruction of their religious understanding. And I use this term foundation because that's used to describe the core, the strength of any physical structure. And if the foundation is weak, the entire structure can collapse and fall apart. Likewise, each person's faith is built on a core foundation. I actually feel kind of cheery now with that. It's very unique. I like that. Likewise, each person's faith. Don't worry, I didn't mean to call you out. Sorry. I really actually did enjoy that. I still have the default T-Mobile ringtone, which drives everyone crazy. That's not an endorsement of T-Mobile, by the way. But yeah, every person's faith is built on a core foundation that has to be strong in order to protect their religious identity, their faith, from being destroyed. And a recent poll indicates that there are areas of confusion, even amongst Muslims in the United States, on some of these core principles that we would consider to be very clearly defined according to the true teachings of Islam, or what we often call in short term, true Islam. And it's actually quite astonishing to see some of the disagreements that the YouGov poll had found last year. But we within the Ahmadiyya Muslim community have found that all Muslims schooled in the true teachings of Islam have never turned to a path of extremism. So we have identified a proposal for a solution that can bind all of us together. We've identified 11 key principles or beliefs at the heart of differentiating between true Islam and the path of extremism. And these principles transcend any sectarian differences. This is not about Shia versus Sunni that has these differences that have split historically the Muslim world into many factions. These principles are those that all Muslims fall in true Islam, Sunni and Shia alike, should be able to, and in fact we've seen they have been able to agree to. And each principle that someone disagrees with, we believe creates a crack in their religious foundation that heightens the possibility of them possibly turning to a path of extremism. And I'll briefly share these now, and with the intent, as when we created this campaign or this platform, to protect not only our own youth from this path of radicalization, but protect our national security as well by helping us identify what are some of these telltale signs that lead people down this path. I had the privilege of speaking at an event in December where the Chief of Police of San Bernardino, the man who led the first responders in the attack on San Bernardino, was in attendance. and that's actually him, Chief Jared. And he was very pleased to hear these 11 principles and has shown his support for it. So let me go by these 11 principles in brief, one by one. Number one, the first principle is that true Islam wholly rejects all forms of terrorism. And this is without exception. The Holy Quran and the Prophet Muhammad had repeatedly and consistently forbidden Muslims from creating disorder in the world, as Salman had mentioned several examples. Thus, every Muslim has to agree, without any qualification, that true Islam recognizes that no justification exists for terrorism against an individual, a government, or a nation, for any reason. And that the actions of these extremists and terrorists who are ascribing to Islam are an absolute violation to Islamic teachings. But there are Muslim leaders who add some sort of qualifying statement. Yes, that's true, unless. And this is why, astonishingly, a Pew Research poll in 2013 found that 8% of Muslims, and now still a minority, but still 8% of Muslims in the US said that violence against civilians is either often or sometimes justified. Once anyone accepts that there's any justification for terrorism, this flawed belief can very easily be exploited by extremists such as Al-Qaeda or Daesh, otherwise known as ISIS, to make the case that their agendas qualify for a justifiable use of force. And that means this crack exists in the foundation currently of 8% of Muslims here in the United States. Number two, true Islam believes in non-violent jihad of the self and by the pen. Islam abhors war and violence, comparing the murder of one innocent soul, as we've seen, to the murder of all of humanity. The Quran explains that Muslims are permitted to fight, but only in self-defense, only after an aggressor first wages war, and that too specifically for your religion. That's why the Quran states, quote, "Permission to fight is given to those against whom war is made, because they have been wronged." But then the very next verse clarifies that the self-defense which is permitted is only to ensure freedom of conscience and freedom of religion for all people. It's not just for Muslims. The Quran states, if God had not repelled some people by means of others, then cloisters and churches and synagogues and mosques, wherein the name of God is oft commemorated, would surely have been destroyed. So fighting is only allowed to defend all houses of worship, not just Muslim houses, not just mosques. And any other fighting is condemned. And that really gets to the heart of this theory within Islam of why you would even pick up the sword. Why would you be permitted to fight? And it's only to defend other people as well as yourself who are whose rights of freedom of religion are being physically taken from them. Instead of a violent jihad, Islam focuses on this is more on the exception when something happens. The rule is that Islam champions an intellectual jihad by the pen, to engage in dialogue and rational discourse regarding matters of faith without any compulsion or forcing someone to believe. Those taught that anything else justifying as jihad can be exploited by further calls to a violent use of force. Number three, true Islam believes in the equality, education, and empowerment of women. The Holy Quran declares, "Whoso does good works, whether male or female, and is a believer, such shall enter heaven." So Islam puts a great deal of value on the equitable status of women, both in the spiritual as well as in the secular world. It was the first religion to champion the educational and economic rights of women. The Prophet Muhammad had once remarked, "It is the duty of every Muslim man and every Muslim woman to acquire knowledge." And it would have been very easy for the Prophet to say, it's the duty and the obligation of every Muslim to acquire knowledge. But the fact that he made it a point to pause and say every Muslim man and every Muslim woman is a reason to pause and reflect, especially for those Muslims who are preventing women from gaining education and gaining that knowledge. He even vouched for Muslim women to be educators. saying that half the religion of Islam can be learned from his wife Aisha. This demonstrates that women in Islam are respected as important sources of knowledge. So when some Muslim leaders teach the subjugation or inferiority of women, they not only run away from true Islam, but they're also creating cracks in the foundation of those Muslims who trust them and look up to them as religious guides. There simply is no room in Islam for the belief that women are inferior to men. Far from it. The Prophet Muhammad had taught that paradise lies at the feet of your mother. And since every woman is a potential mother, the teaching that we see within Islam is that paradise is obtained by serving and respecting women. Once any Muslim accepts this idea of devaluing a woman's life below that of a man, that habit of devaluing humans can easily be tapped into by extremist clerics. And the idea of subjugating a human being can simply never be accepted within Islam. And anyone professing to follow true Islam would agree. Number 4, true Islam advocates for freedom of conscience, religion, and speech. And this understanding stems directly from the Holy Quran, when it says in chapter 2, there can be no compulsion in matters of religion. Therefore, true Islam wholeheartedly supports the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which, like true Islam, guarantees freedom of conscience, religion, and speech. And this is critical. Once a Muslim accepts that violence or maybe even death is an appropriate response to unseemly speech or someone who defames Islam or God or the Prophet, or even someone who chooses to leave Islam altogether, it is incredibly easy to then have terrorist groups like Daesh and Al-Qaeda, etc., capitalize on that belief and convince such a person that they can take matters into their own hands because this person has forfeited the right to live. And this idea that any worldly punishment is sanctioned for vile or unseemly speech or the choice of one religion over the other is a telltale sign that someone is at least susceptible to the path towards extremism, or perhaps is already even walking on the path themselves. True Islam does not sanction this flawed belief at all. True Islam advocates, number 5, True Islam advocates for the complete separation of mosque and state. The Holy Quran does not endorse any specific form of government. All it says is that it requires justice to oversee whatever form is used. So instead of instructing the leaders who are put in positions of authority to be religious, the Quran simply tells the leaders to be just. So justice, not religion, is the determinative factor when governing any society. The Quran actually forbids the imposition of a theocratic state, and it forbids all religious compulsion. Any attempt to implement a system of governance that imposes Islam on non-Muslims would be tantamount to coercion, which is explicitly forbidden in Islam. And that's why this word Sharia has to be reclaimed by Muslims. Instead of casting it aside and saying Sharia doesn't have any role in Islam, is to reclaim it. Sharia is an Arabic word which refers to the path a Muslim follows to increase the relationship with God and follow the life of a Muslim as a self-governance, not as a system of government to be legislated in any land. Islam actually pleads for a secular form of government, and anyone adhering to Islam has to prevent themselves from ever accepting this notion that Islam is meant to be legislated as a form of government. It simply is not, nor is there any precedent within the life of the Prophet Muhammad that ever did he legislate Islam as a form of government. Number 6, true Islam requires loyalty and obedience to one's country of residence and its laws. The Holy Quran states, O ye who believe, obey Allah and obey the Prophet and obey those in authority among you. So this means that a Muslim's obedience and loyalty to the government is actually required as a part of our faith, regardless of the faith of those in power. In this respect, the Prophet even said, you should listen to and obey your ruler even if you despise him. There's a lot of despising in today's political climate. No name shall be named in this law. As we're told not to curse. Of course, loyalty and gratitude to America doesn't forbid us from expressing dissent. Disagreement should be expressed. I mean, that's what a democracy is all about, but within the confines of the law. So no Muslim can take the law into his or her own hands. The Holy Quran states, as Salman pointed out on several occasions, that creating disorder and threatening the stability of society leads to damnation, not to salvation. But there are, unfortunately, Muslims who think that there is a conflict between being a Muslim and being an American, or a conflict between Sharia and the U.S. Constitution. Such beliefs don't make someone an extremist, but they do leave a gaping hole in that person's religious foundation that makes them susceptible to extremism. Number 7, true Islam encompasses the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a declaration adopted by the United Nations in 1948 to secure fundamental human rights for everyone without any exception. And true Islam values all human life, recognizing the universal human rights as a fundamental tenet of our faith. And it emphasizes that all humans share a single creator and rejects any notion of racial or ethnic superiority. In fact, in his farewell sermon, the Prophet Muhammad was quoted as saying, "O people, your God is one, and your ancestor is one. An Arab possesses no superiority over a non-Arab, nor does a non-Arab over an Arab. A white man is in no way superior to a black, nor for that matter is a black man better than a white, but only to the extent to which he discharges his duty to God and man." And in the sight of God, it's really your behavior that will set you apart from others. Muslims who feel that there's the value and the rights granted to Muslims are not all protected to non-Muslims are prime targets for extremists. Number 8, true Islam believes in all verses of the Quran and forbids lying. Now, extremists attempting to exploit Islam argue that some Quranic verses abrogate or cancel out other Quranic verses. And this flawed theory is a very slippery slope, because it could be used to justify ignoring any part of the Quran, arguing that it's been canceled out by other verses. And this belief is used to argue that the so-called violent verses, the verses talking about what to do when you're in a state of war, when war has been brought to you, that those violent verses, especially when they're decontextualized, cancel out or nullify the rest of the Quran that calls for peace and justice and understanding and tolerance. Putting aside the fact that these verses that they speak of only say to do that in self-defense, still claiming that these verses nullify the rest of the Quran is simply not sanctioned in Islam. There's even a verse in the Quran that says this is a perfect book. There is no doubt in it. It's a guidance for the righteous. So if God is saying that it's a perfect book, how can we say that we only accept some parts of it? Extremists also argue that Islam permits treachery or lying, this Arabic word that's called taqiyya, which is that you can somehow lie in order to deceive others in matters of their faith. But this is patently absurd. The Prophet Muhammad even instructed Muslims by saying it is obligatory for you to tell the truth. And there was no qualifying statement, unless blah, blah, blah. Deception and lying are simply incompatible with Islam. Number 9, true Islam recognizes that no religion can monopolize heaven or monopolize salvation. The Holy Quran declares, "Surely those who believe, and the Jews, and the Christians, and the Sabians," referring to those of non-Abrahamic tradition, "whichever party from among these truly believes in God and the last day, and does good deeds, shall have their reward from their Lord, and no fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve." So this verse demonstrates that it's not just Muslims who will receive the rewards of their good lives or their good deeds. Jews, Christians, and those of non-Abrahamic religions can and all will be rewarded for their good deeds and their faith. So it's impossible for Muslims to declare some monopoly over salvation. And this is important in the fight against extremism, because once someone's been taught that only their people could go to heaven and the others are going to hell, that now sets a different value system of how much value you attribute to those who are going to hell anyways. And so they could be convinced, hey, these guys are going to hell anyways, God's going to fry them in hell, may as well start that process here in this life. For them, this becomes fertile soil for extremists to plant that seed of hate and violence. Number 10, true Islam believes in the need for unified spiritual leadership to guide Muslims. The Holy Quran implores Muslims to promote peace by remaining united. As it says, hold fast all together by the rope of Allah and be not divided. And remember the favor of Allah which He bestowed upon you when you were enemies, and He united your hearts in love, so that by His grace you became as brothers. So true Islam teaches Muslims how necessary it is to remain united as one community, and that the best protection against violence and discord is to remain as one community. And Muslims embrace this teaching. And upon the Prophet's demise, Muslims everywhere united under this Islamic institution of divinely appointed leadership called the Caliphate. And that's what the word Caliphate means. It's the English rendition of the Arabic word Khilafat, which refers to a system of successorship to a leader, the Prophet. It's a spiritual leadership. It's not temporal or political leadership or some sort of Islamic state. According to true Islam, Khilafat is not a theocratic state. It's a spiritual leadership, and any Muslim who believes that universal leadership establishes some sort of Islamic state and legislates man's relationship with God has taken large strides towards extremist ideology and groups like ISIS. And finally, true Islam rejects the concept of a violent Messiah. Now this may sound like a surprising final principle, but it's key. The Prophet Muhammad had foretold the advent of a second Messiah in the latter days, who would bring about this renaissance within Islam. Sadly, there are Muslims who believe, even in the United States, that this bloody return, this bloody type of a Messiah who will come with a sword and kill those in his path. And this is a big problem, as these even Western Muslims are not extremists themselves, but who have been taught by their seemingly peaceful leaders that when the Messiah comes, it won't be a friendly coming for those who are not Muslim. Now, true Islam teaches that the coming Messiah will rid the world of injustice and misguided beliefs through rational and logical arguments. That will be his only weapon, not violence. And this belief is in exact accordance with the teachings of the Prophet, who said that the Messiah will come and arbitrate with justice, not the sword. So that's why true Islam recognizes that the Messiah can never attempt to bring harm to those who don't accept Islam. But once a Muslim believes that this Messiah to come will be violent, then they can be convinced to commit the same type of violence in anticipation of his coming. Any Muslim believing in the coming of a violent or a bloody Messiah is a potential extremist. So as you can see, disbelief in any of these principles, we believe, is a warning sign of someone's ability to be recruited to extremism by those who are inspired by war, by dominion, by destruction. And that's why these 11 points comprise a new initiative and platform that's called True Islam and the Extremists, speaking about this narrative of true Islam on the one hand and extremists on the other, both bound yet separated by these 11 principles. And this is our effort to unite Muslims as well as non-Muslims in this effort. There's a reason we believe that thousands of people are now turning to trueislam.com to unite on this platform. They're clicking on endorse. They're actually putting their name up there, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, to say that we believe in these principles, that these will protect our national security, and this can be a good way to confront extremism. We've even had members of the House of Congress on both sides of the fence. How often is it you can unite the House of Congress to actually some sort of action? But this is where we are asking to call others to join us in defeating this rhetoric of extremists by joining the effort in this initiative. I ask you to please take a look at trueislam.com and see if this is something that you'd be willing to support. And let's save the world from the scourge of terrorism and extremists and increase our national security by cutting off the ability of extremists to use religious language and vernacular in their brutal ideology. I thank you for your time and patience and look forward to the dialogue.